What's going on, you guys? We are back in the building. I know it's been quite some time since we've recorded really anything sports related in the last couple of months, but we are back. And on top of that, NFL football is back. We're just about to finish week one of the NFL regular season. And I got to say, it was quite a start to the season, just based off of what we saw this past weekend. Obviously, at the beginning of week one, we had the Lions had a really close game against the Chiefs. Mind you, the Lions were going on the road with the Chiefs celebrating their Super Bowl victory from last year. But the Lions go in there and get an impressive win to start off the year. They start off 0-1, and with the Super Bowl champs sitting at 0-1, it's kind of a weird situation with the Chiefs. I still think that they'll be able to bounce back, but nonetheless, we got off to a really hot start with that Lions and Chiefs game. And then really going into yesterday, when it comes to how I'm going to go over some of these games, it's going to be pretty simple. I'm going to go over some of the notable games that we saw from yesterday, just to kind of give you guys a rundown of what we're looking at. I'll just go in order with how I have it. The first one I'm going to go over is definitely going to be the Cowboys just utterly destroying the Giants last night. That was the Sunday night game on NBC. And I mean, just based off of the first quarter alone, I mean, the Cowboys just completely annihilated the Giants. They were forcing turnovers, they were getting sacks. It was one of the most impressive ass beatings I've seen in quite some time. The Cowboys win that one by the score of 40-0. Quite an impressive road win to start the year for the Cowboys. After that, we would transition to the Dolphins and the Chargers game. Guys, this was simply a track meet as far as I see it. This was just a back and forth affair offensively with both the Dolphins offense and the Chargers offense just really going back and forth and really making this quite a compelling game. But we see the Dolphins have an impressive road win over the Chargers, winning by the score of 36-34. I know a lot of people had been looking at Tua Tagovailoa with the injury history that he had last year, specifically pertaining to the concussions that he sustained, and whether or not that his career was in some sort of doubt just based off of the head injuries that he sustained last year. Well, he comes into this year, week one, and just absolutely lights it up, throwing for over 400 yards, throws 3 touchdowns. Despite the fact that he only had 1 interception in this game, he was extremely impressive in this game. Going on the road in the LA, quite an impressive win for Miami to start off the year. After that, we will transition to the Patriots and Eagles matchup. This was a very close game as far as I see it. When you look at this game in particular, it didn't start off that way. The Eagles got off to a very hot start, but the Patriots were able to claw back into this game, making competitive. But nonetheless, the Eagles come back off of a really tough Super Bowl loss last year and start off the year 1-0. We'll talk about that game a little more in detail the more we get along into the episode. After that, we will transition to probably one of the bigger upsets from this past weekend, which was the Bucs going on the road to defeat the Minnesota Vikings on the road. And looking at the Bucs had gone through a lot of offseason changes over the last couple of months. Obviously, you have Tom Brady departing via retirement. You bring Baker Mayfield into the fold, and one of the concerns with the Bucs this year, just based off of what we saw from last year, was whether or not they'd be able to protect their quarterback position. Just because Tom was getting, I would say, relentlessly pressured last year. He was sacked a pretty high number of times, and it really threw the offense into dysfunction. But I gotta say, the Bucs did a pretty good job being able to, go through some of the adversities that came early on in this game, and they were able to sustain some good drives later in the second half, and they were able to step up defensively, force some turnovers against the Vikings, and squeak out a 3-point win in Baker Mayfield's first start as the quarterback for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So probably one of the bigger upsets that I saw from this past weekend. We'll go into that game a little bit more towards the end of the episode. And then after that, we'll talk about probably one of the more shocking results with the Browns just absolutely destroying the Bengals. And, I want to give credit where credit is due. The Browns did a great job running the ball, controlling the game from beginning to end. But their defense really stepped up here and forced the Bengals into a situation where they could not get anything sustained on offense throughout the entire course of the game. The Bengals only scored 3 points in this game. They lost by the score of 24-3. And Joe Burrow, coming off of a new contract extension where he is now the highest paid player in NFL history, threw for only 82 yards in this game. That's something that we will discuss more in detail, kind of similar to what I said with the Bucks towards the end of the episode, but kind of a similar situation with the Bengals this year compared to last year. Bengals lost their opener at home to the Steelers, and they get absolutely destroyed by the Browns on the road in Cleveland. And then to wrap up the NFL portion of the episode, we'll talk a little bit about the upcoming Monday night game that's going to feature the Buffalo Bills and the New York Jets. This is going to be a very compelling game as far as I see it, just because you got two AFC East rivals going at it, but now you have the infusion of Aaron Rodgers at the quarterback position with the New York Jets. This is going to be a great quarterback matchup with Aaron Rodgers going up against Josh Allen, some of the most prolific quarterbacks that are available in today's game. So that's going to be a very interesting matchup. That game is taking place in MetLife Stadium. So, I mean, they just had a game in MetLife last night with the Giants being the home team. So I imagine the grounds crew and the stadium crew had quite a busy night, essentially changing over the entire stadium from everything that was labeled Giants across the stadium. And now you got to transition it to all Jets before this Monday night matchup. And then after that, we will talk about UFC 293. We're going to talk specifically just about the Sean Strickland and Israel Adesanya fight. Sean Strickland is now the UFC champion by defeating, in probably one of the most shocking upsets that we've seen in quite some time, over Israel Adesanya. This was a fight that I didn't expect it to go down the way that it did. But the fact that Sean Strickland won 4 out of 5 rounds in this fight, to be able to to win the UFC middleweight belt is quite an impressive feat. And we'll talk about that more in detail towards the end of the episode. But that's pretty much going to be the slate for today's episode, you guys. So let's not waste any more time. Let's dive into this first matchup, which was just an utter ass beating from the Dallas Cowboys to the New York Giants. Like I said at the top, the Giants get absolutely obliterated by the score of 40-0 by the Dallas Cowboys. I have to be honest with you guys. This game I thought would be a little bit more compelling just because the Giants had made some offseason moves to bolster their roster. Daniel Jones gets a huge contract extension where he's getting paid upwards of $40 million a year. And I thought just overall, they would have been more impressive on offense, just with the infusion of Darren Waller into the offense. They're getting some guys back from injury last year. I thought they would have made a more impressive showing in this game. And it was the utter opposite of that. Dallas just dominated this game from beginning to end. I mean, if we're looking at this just from a boxing perspective, the Cowboys were throwing 10-8 rounds against the Giants the entire night. Offensively, defensively, they were solid. Now, I will say when it comes to Dallas, this wasn't the most impressive offensive performance, but they didn't need that in any way, shape, or form. The defense was stepping up in a significant way that just completely threw off whatever sort of rhythm the Giants were trying to establish in that game. And no matter what the Giants did, it seemed like the Cowboys had an answer for it defensively the entire night. It just seemed like the Giants were completely out of sorts early on, and they couldn't establish really anything throughout the entire course of the game. I mean, looking back at this game, Dak Prescott only threw for like 150, 160 yards in this game. I mean, Tony Pollard was effective. He had 2 touchdowns in this game, but offensively, the Cowboys didn't even get over 300 yards of total offense. So it really kind of goes to show this was not the greatest offensive performance from the Cowboys, but they didn't need it with such a well-rounded performance from what their defense was able to get. 7 total sacks in this game. I mean, when you get 7 sacks against a team like the Giants, who is an NFC East rival, I should add, by the way. You know, this is a game where, you know, both of these teams do not like each other, especially when it comes to the fan bases. And, you know, going into week 1, you know, there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of, you know, potential of where, you know, both these teams could go. And I think both teams had a realistic expectation of making this a competitive game. But when it comes to the Giants, they were just completely overwhelmed and they had no answer whatsoever. You know, on top of that, the Cowboys were able to force turnovers, get the ball back into Dak's hands and the Cowboys offense. And just like I said, when you win this game by 40-0 with the season opener, I don't think you could really ask for a better start when you're looking at this from a Cowboys perspective. Now, I will say it's week 1, and week 1, there's a lot to be had as far as where teams could go. And just because the Cowboys won this game by 40 points, it doesn't mean that they're going to just completely win all of these games from here on out in similar fashion. They're going to go up against more difficult challenges. And I imagine they're still going to make adjustments just because the Cowboys were extremely decisive in this win. It doesn't mean that they're not going to make adjustments. They will make adjustments. They'll try to make some personnel and maybe some formation changes by putting guys in different spots, just to give the other teams that they're going to face some different looks. But nonetheless, an extremely impressive win by the Dallas Cowboys in this Week 1 victory. And I will say, this is something that I have to mention with the Giants. Imagine you being a Giants fan, and you've been waiting all offseason. The offseason has been, what, 6, 7, 8 months for Giants fans? I mean, it's been a long time coming. And, you know, seeing Daniel Jones get a contract extension, seeing Darren Waller come into the fold to kind of bolster the offense, having Saquon Barkley still on this roster, I imagine Giants fans were probably of the mindset, it's like, okay, there's some potential. We'll see what happens with the defense. And, maybe we could be able to be a competitive team in the NFC East this year. Granted, you still have to go up against teams like the Eagles and the Cowboys, but you think it would be at least a decent shot to be competitive in the NFC East, at least if you're looking at this from an optimistic perspective. Well, that completely went out the window. Just waiting 8 months to see your team get absolutely destroyed by 40 points at home, it has to be extremely deflating if you're a Giants fan. Now, hopefully, the Giants can be able to rebound from this utter ass beating and find some stability going into Week 2. I will say, it can't be any worse than this. Getting beat by 40 points at home, unless you get beat by 50 points and you don't score any points, I mean, then at that point, it could be worse. But I highly doubt that's going to happen. So I will be of the mindset that Brian Daboll will be able to get this group back into a competitive situation going into Week 2, because this was just embarrassing as far as I see it. And I will say, when it comes to the weather conditions in this game, this is something that was kind of a focal piece, especially if you were playing in the Northeast yesterday. It seemed like there was definitely some rain in that part of the country yesterday that definitely impacted this game, or not only impacted this game, but impacted some of these games, just because, there were a case of the drops, there were a case of fumbles, just because it just seemed like there was a lot more moisture in the air, and, guys were having a difficult time being able to retain the ball compared to what we typically see during dry conditions. But yeah, it just seemed like the Giants were just completely overwhelmed, and then the turnover situation just what made it bad to worse as far as I see it. So if you're a Giants fan, hopefully, the team could turn it around sooner rather than later. But if you're a Cowboys fan, I got to admit, you're probably feeling on cloud nine this morning after, that type of win. It's one thing to be decisive in a win. I mean, this was just outright domination from the Dallas Cowboys, and we'll see if they can be able to continue their success going into Week 2. Now, going into our next game, we're going to dive into the Dolphins and Chargers game. This was probably one of the most exciting games that we saw from yesterday, just simply from an offensive perspective. If you like offense, this was the game to watch yesterday. This was a game that took place in the later afternoon slate of games. This was the 4:25 games. And from beginning to end, this was just a fun game to watch. But the Miami Dolphins go on the road and win by the score of 36-34. And, looking at this game in particular, just kind of the lead up into this game, you got Tua Tagovailoa going up against Justin Herbert, some really good up and coming quarterbacks in this league, especially with Justin. Justin has really shown that he can really lead a prolific offense in this league early on in his career. But when you juxtapose it to what Tua brings to the table, there were a lot of people that were legitimately concerned about Tua's long-term look, or long-term future, I should say, in the NFL, based on the concussions that he sustained last year. He sustained multiple concussions throughout the year last year and ended up missing a sizable amount of time throughout the entire season. And it even took Mike McDaniel saying multiple times to the press where he was looking at the long-term view of Tua's health, and he wasn't going to put him out there back on the field last year, despite the fact if he had passed concussion protocol towards the end of the regular season last year. And I think he kept that in mind just to look at the long-term health of his quarterback. And I will say, I had similar feelings when it came to Tua. And I think for the most part, if you put that to the side and you just look at what he's able to do, Tua can be an extremely effective quarterback, despite the fact that he's not the biggest quarterback in the league. He is undersized. But going into the game yesterday, man, he was impressive. 3 touchdowns, throws for over 450 yards. He throws to Tyreek Hill, who's probably his favorite target at this point. Tyreek Hill gets over 200 yards receiving, gets 2 touchdowns in this game. This was incredible from Tua. And it's just kind of one of those things. You go from what Tua was facing last year to this, where he by far and away had the best quarterback performance out of any quarterback yesterday. I mean, that is really a positive sight to see. Not just from a Miami Dolphin perspective, but if you're just a casual NFL fan that's just paying attention to what's going on throughout the league, Tua's injuries from last year definitely caught everybody's attention just because they were really concerned about his long-term health. And the fact that he was able to stay relatively upright yesterday is a great thing to see. And not only that, you look at what the Chargers were able to do. The Chargers were going back and forth with the Dolphins yesterday. So, I mean, this was an offensive show from beginning to end. But, Tua was able to connect with Tyreek Hill for the go-ahead touchdown with just about, I'd say about a minute 45 left in the fourth quarter. And the Chargers couldn't be able to respond in kind to take the lead and potentially the win, because the Dolphins were only up 2 points late in that fourth quarter. The Chargers could have led a drive to potentially win the game on a game-winning field goal. They just couldn't be able to string those plays along to make that happen. But, the Dolphins go on the road with a huge win in week 1 to start the year 1-0. And I will say, when it comes to both of these teams, I think from an offensive perspective, I think both coaches can look at these performances and they could probably say this was a really good offensive performance. We were able to establish some things early and really show that we could be capable offenses moving forward. But I will say, from a defensive perspective, this was just an utter abomination for both teams. I think both coaches are going to look at their defenses and basically ask more of them. It's like, we cannot have these performances where we're giving up 30 plus points. That's not sustainable, no matter how we look at it. And I will say, just to kind of make a caveat with this, it is week 1. These teams, it's kind of similar to what I said in the Cowboys and Giants game. These teams are going to make adjustments throughout the first month of the year, simply just because I kind of take the Bill Belichick stance when it comes to the first month of the season. September is essentially an extension of the preseason as far as I see it. Teams are still figuring out who is going to be in the right personnel groupings, and there's going to be injuries that are going to be sustained. So guys are going to have to come into situations where they're going to have to play the next man up and try to rise to the occasion. So, I think there's going to be a little bit of, I'm not going to say ugly football per se, but I think these coaches, they know that this is not going to be the peak performance of their respective teams, just because, to me, these teams really don't start rounding into form probably around mid-October. That's usually where I kind of see where teams are either they're on the right path or they're going to be on a very up and down trajectory the entire year. If you really don't have things figured out by that point of, I'd say week 5, week 6, you're probably going to be in a little bit of trouble, especially if you're under 500 and your defense is still giving up 25, 30 points, or if your offense really isn't putting up points on the board. But, week 1 with this Dolphins and Chargers game, this was an extremely impressive offensive performance. And I mean, I got to say, when it comes to Tyreek Hill is probably one of the most electrifying players in the NFL that I've seen probably in the last, couple years. Just with the fact that he's able to just burn by whatever sort of coverage that an opposing defense gives him. He's just a freak athlete. For going over 200 yards receiving in the first game of the year, that's an impressive start. I mean, if he's trying to go for 2,000 yards receiving this year, he's off to a very good start. He's got, 16 more games to go. I think there's a very good chance that as long as he and Tua can be able to maintain the chemistry from this week 1 performance and bring it forward for the rest of the season, there's a very good chance that Tua and Tyreek can maintain this relationship and where Tyreek can get 2,000 yards receiving. I think that's a real possibility this year. But We'll have to see how it plays out. But I really just want to make the point. It was really nice to see Tua be effective in the role at that quarterback position, despite all of the, I won't say negativity. Negativity is not the right word. I would say just dealing with the possibility of just that long term health concern. With that being in mind, it was really nice to see him go from where he was last year in this first game. Had the best quarterback performance as far as I see it in week one. It was a really nice thing to see. After that, we're going to transition into the Patriots and Eagles matchup from yesterday. This was quite a game just because this game really had some ebbs and flows as far as I see it. When it came to the Eagles got off to a very hot start in this game. Oh, I shouldn't mention that the Eagles won this game by the score of 25-20. Um, when I look at this game in particular, like I said, there were a lot of ebbs and flows in this game. The Eagles go up 16-0 relatively early in this game. The Eagles were able to force 2 turnovers from the Patriots on back-to-back plays. One being a pick six, and then one being an Ezekiel Elliott fumble that they recovered, and they were able to convert into a touchdown right after. So it was extremely impressive that the Eagles, despite the fact they were coming off of a Super Bowl loss to the Chiefs last year, I mean, going on the road to play the New England Patriots, and you're up 16-0 in the first quarter. I mean, that's a hell of a start. But I will say, give the Patriots credit. They got off to a terrible start, but they were able to regroup, and they were able to establish some drives in that second quarter where Mac Jones finally got into a rhythm. He was able to get comfortable, and they were able to lead back-to-back touchdown drives to make the game 16-14 at halftime. And then I would say that the second half of this game was kind of a trudge match. There was a lot of, this was kind of, the second half was really kind of predicated on the defense as far as I'm concerned for both teams. I thought both defenses really in the second half really played up to snuff. Especially, I'll focus on the Eagles just because the Eagles, they did give up one late touchdown from the Patriots to kind of make it a little bit more interesting. But, there were drives where the Patriots had ample opportunities to either score a touchdown or just take the lead in general. But the Eagles were able to bring an effective pass rush late in this game, and they were able to get to Mac Jones, force him off of his spot, and throw some errant passes, or just completely throw off the timing of the play where, Mac had to throw it into a bad coverage against what he was going with. But really, to me, I will say this is kind of one of those games where I don't want to say it was a tale of two halves just because the Eagles and the Patriots really kind of went back and forth in the first half. But this was really, I think, where the defense has stepped up. I think that's really kind of the angle I want to hone in on, just because I thought both defenses, despite the fact that it was raining in this game pretty heavily in the first half, both defenses I really thought came to play in this game. Offensively, I thought the Eagles were impressive for, I'd say, maybe the first quarter, but after that, it was kind of an uphill battle for the Eagles offense. The Patriots defense really impressed me in this game, but to me, I will say the Eagles defense, when they needed to, they stepped up, made the plays that needed to be made, and ended up getting a very close road win in week one to start off the year 1-0. When it comes to the Eagles, just going into week two, they're going to have to definitely improve their offensive efficiency. And that could just be because that Patriots defense, I think it's going to be a relatively good defense this year. I wouldn't be surprised if the Patriots are able to play at that level against the Eagles. And the Eagles had a really good offense last year. I mean, when you look at Jalen Hurts was one of the highest scoring fantasy quarterbacks in the league last year. And the Eagles had one of the most prolific offenses in the NFL to go along with that. When you look at that Patriots defense, I mean, outside of, I'd say, the first quarter, the Patriots were able to hold the Eagles to field goals. And you take away those 2 turnovers in back-to-back possessions by the Patriots, I think we're looking at a different result here. I think the Patriots probably win this game in a relatively close score, and the Eagles are sitting at an 0-1 position. So I think if you're the Eagles, I think there's a little bit of concern, but like I said, it's week one. There are going to be adjustments that will be made, and I wouldn't be surprised that the Eagles are going to be able to reestablish that effective offense that they had from last year. You have Jalen Hurts, who's one of the more electrifying quarterbacks in the NFL. They have a great read option offense, and they do a great job being effective in that offensive style. So I wouldn't be surprised that, the Eagles really start ramping it up in the next couple of weeks or so. And defensively, I think that they'll be just fine. To me, the Eagles are still one of the most well-rounded teams in the NFL. They were able to retain most of their core from last year. Granted, they have lost some pieces. I don't want to miss that entirely. But overall, I still think the Eagles are in a really good position to be able to be successful this year. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're basically one of the top teams in the NFC when it's all said and done for the regular season. When you juxtapose that to the Patriots, look, the Patriots had a very up and down year last year. And, I'm going to try to put my bias aside here. I mean, if you guys can see, if you're listening, you can't really see it, but I got a bunch of Patriot stuff on my wall behind me. So I'm going to try to keep that in mind. I'll try to keep my bias aside here. But it was kind of a tough situation with Matt Patricia coordinating the offense last year. And I will say, if you're looking at the Patriots offense from what I saw in week one, take away the first quarter, because the first quarter was just an absolute disaster as far as I see it. The Patriots were able to lead effective drives, and they were able to get down the field relatively quickly in some of these drives. And to me, a lot of credit goes to Bill O'Brien. This was one of the hires that I thought the Patriots were really successful in this offseason. To me, this was probably one of the most impactful signings that the Patriots could have made this offseason. Granted, you can bring in different players into the fold, and that can make a difference. But to me, having somebody to coordinate the offense and who has a relationship with Mac Jones, just because Mac Jones and Bill O'Brien were in Alabama at the time when Mac Jones was the quarterback with Alabama for the Crimson Tide, it seemed like they were able to be just more comfortable. I think Mac was in a situation where he didn't look as frustrated. He wasn't as angry as what we saw last year, just because I think there was a lot of discontent between Matt Patricia, the offensive coaching staff, and Mac Jones. Because Mac Jones had a relatively effective rookie year, and then he definitely took a step back last year. There's no denying that. But, going up against a defense like the Eagles, who can be one of the best defenses in the NFL, just the amount of sacks they were able to accrue last year was quite impressive. The fact that they were only able to get 2 sacks against Mac Jones yesterday, you got to give a lot of respect to the Patriots offensive line. And that was despite the fact that the Patriots were missing their starting guards yesterday in Cole Strange and Michael Onwenu. That you give credit to Bill O'Brien and really the offensive staff for getting these guys ready to go, despite having those 2 guys inactive at the starting guard position. And I thought Mac Jones was pretty effective yesterday. I understand the first quarter didn't go as planned, but there were stretches throughout this game where Mac was able to get into a rhythm and he was able to get some good drives. And I think one of the things that Mac Jones and Bill O'Brien are probably going to have to work through throughout the first couple of weeks or so is, Mac is going to have to be a little bit more effective in trying to put a little bit more zip on the ball. I think there were times yesterday where Mac looked like he was underthrowing the ball. That could be a factor of it was raining in Foxborough yesterday. Maybe the ball was just a little bit slick and he couldn't get, the best handle on some of his passes. But, there were times where I thought Mac looked pretty good out there. And there were times where, Mac either held on to the ball too long or he just threw an errant pass. And that was just based on the weather conditions potentially. So overall, I think if you're a Patriots fan, I think there's definitely some positive takeaways that you can look back to from yesterday's game despite the loss. I think the offense does look to be a little bit more potent this year than they were last year. And I will say, when it comes from a red zone perspective, they looked far more effective yesterday in the red zone than they did last year by a wide margin. And if you're able to do that against what I would consider is a pretty good defense with what the Eagles have, I think that could bode well for the Patriots moving forward. Now, I will say, when it comes to the Patriots, they're in the AFC East. You got to deal with the Bills, the Jets, and the Dolphins. The Dolphins just put up 36 points in week 1 against the Chargers. That is not going to be an easy situation for the Patriots moving forward. And then you got the Bills and the Jets. The Bills are pretty much the top of the AFC East right now. You got the Jets, who are bringing Aaron Rodgers into the fold. They're going to be a much better team offensively than they were last year with Zach Wilson being quarterback for the Jets. So, the Patriots are going to have to be very careful here moving forward, just because they have the toughest schedule in the NFL this year. Granted, it looks like they have stabilized some things on the offense this year, and defensively, they could potentially be a top 10 defense if they're able to establish this type of consistent pass rush and if they're able to get off the field more times than not against opposing offenses, it could bode well for the Patriots defense this year. But in my mind, the Patriots are going to have an uphill battle this year. And, I will say that, there are some positive things that you could take away from yesterday's loss, but I think it's still going to be a tricky situation for the Patriots moving forward. But I wouldn't say it was the worst loss from the Patriots yesterday, but nonetheless, tough one, especially with Tom Brady coming back and being celebrated at halftime by Robert Kraft and the Patriots organization. So after that, we are going to transition to the Buccaneers and Vikings game. Like I said at the top, this was probably one of the more shocking results yesterday. To me, this was the upset of the day, just based off of how good the Vikings were last year compared to how inept the Buccaneers were last year. But the Buccaneers go on the road and they defeat the Minnesota Vikings by the score of 20-17. This was a game to me where, I'm going to be honest with you guys, the Vikings squandered this one. The Vikings are, in my eyes, a much better team than the Buccaneers, but the Vikings didn't play like it yesterday. The Vikings had multiple turnovers yesterday that really put them in a bind. And one of these turnovers took place in the red zone where Kirk Cousins got picked off at the end zone. And it looked like the Vikings were going to march down the field and score on that possession. And, give credit to the Bucs defense. The Bucs defense was able to step up and get a huge interception in that moment. And to me, that was one of the momentum shifters early on in that game. And, when you look at the Buccaneers are going through some changes. This offseason, they lost Tom Brady due to him retiring. You're bringing Baker Mayfield into the fold. You're dealing with all of these question marks at the offensive line position just based on how bad they looked in that position last year with Tom Brady getting pressured, getting sacked, looking like he can never get into a rhythm last year. And now you have Baker Mayfield into the fold where he hasn't been the most, albeit I'll say, consistent quarterback in the NFL. He's had some ups and downs throughout his career. You just don't really know what you're going to get from the Bucs. And I will say, going on the road and holding that Vikings offense to 17 points was quite impressive. This was not something that I was expecting. I was expecting the Bucs to probably get their ass whooped in this game, just because I didn't have a lot of faith that Baker Mayfield could be able to lead an effective offense against the Vikings. Granted, I wouldn't say the Vikings have the best defense to work with, but I just thought that there were too many question marks with the Buccaneers, especially with their offensive line play from last year. But it looks like, granted, it is week one, so things can change. I'm not saying that this is going to be a thing of consistency when it comes to the Bucs. But the Bucs only gave up one sack yesterday. That's quite impressive. And if it continues that way, maybe the Buccaneers can be a little bit more viable in the NFC South this year than I originally anticipated. But Baker Mayfield didn't really squander this game for the Bucs. I thought Baker played a relatively clean game yesterday. The Buccaneers had no turnovers yesterday. They were relatively, how should I say this? They weren't great offensively yesterday, but when they needed to be, they did what they needed to do. And Baker didn't force any situations, against his own team, and he didn't put the ball in harm's way too many times yesterday. And I think if you're looking at this from a coaching perspective with the Buccaneers, I think this is really the best thing that you could hope for in a road game against the Vikings. So I got to give credit to the Bucs here. I didn't expect them to go on the road and get this upset win in week one, but you got to give credit where credit is due. And that defense really stepped up yesterday with forcing 3 turnovers against that Vikings offense. This Vikings offense can really play a high level of football where this team could score 25, 30 points consistently. But, that Bucs defense, man, they stepped up and definitely made some plays, especially when they needed to. As of right now, the Bucs are sitting at 0-1 at 1-0. The Vikings are sitting at 0-1. Both these teams will make adjustments as far as I see it. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Vikings are able to bounce back relatively quickly from this loss. And when it comes to the Bucs, I'm still a little bit skeptical of them. Granted, they're off to a 1-0 start, which is, fantastic. But as far as I see it, when it comes to the Bucs, I still believe they have an uphill battle against them this upcoming year. I just have to see consistency from the offensive line. If they're able to maintain a decent offensive line as far as not allowing sacks, opening up run lanes for the running backs. I think it will serve them well. It's just they have to be able to maintain it. If they're able to do that, I think they'll be fine. And when it comes to Minnesota squandered this one, like I said at the top. Turnovers, getting sacked. You just can't have that. It's not a formula for success. But like I said, I'm basically just kind of like a broken record at this point. It's week 1. I'm not going to make too much of these losses. Maybe the Giants one is a little bit different just because they got absolutely destroyed. But, the Vikings had chances to win this game. They couldn't cash in on some of their possessions. And, turning the ball over, it's never a winning formula as far as I see it. So, there's going to be some things that, the Vikings could look back at this past weekend and make adjustments from that. But I still believe the Vikings will be a competitive force in the NFC North this upcoming year, or this for the rest of the season, I should say. And after that, we are going to transition to kind of a similar situation that we saw as far as a shocking result, I should say. And that is the Browns essentially destroying the Cincinnati Bengals by the score of 24-3. This was really a shocking result as far as I see it. And it really had to do with the Browns defense. You win by 3 touchdowns and you are able to maintain this this Bengals offense to 3 points where Joe Burrow only throws for 80 yards passing. I mean, from a coaching perspective, you cannot ask for anything better as far as I say it, or as far as I see it. You look at this game in particular, this wasn't what I would consider the best offensive performance when it comes from the Browns. The Browns were able to establish a good run game with Nick Chubb. He did get over 100 yards. Deshaun Watson had a relatively decent day yesterday. I wouldn't say he had like this earth-shattering performance where he just lit it up like Tua against the Chargers. Deshaun only had 154 yards passing, had a touchdown, had an interception. They were able to do enough, but to me, this had really to do with the defense of the Browns. I mean, you look at the Bengals. The Bengals have a very high-flying offense with Joe Burrow, Joe Mixon out of the backfield. You got Jamar Chase, T. Higgins. I mean, this is an offense that could put up 25, 30-plus points consistently. And, man, you only put 3 points on the board. You got to give credit to this Browns defense. The Browns defense came to play. And, I understand this is an AFC North divisional matchup. And there's probably some bad blood between these teams as far as a rivalry is concerned. But, man, this is an impressive win from the Browns to start off the year. I really want to focus on the Bengals here just because, the Bengals are going to be one of the better teams in the AFC this year. I'm not really too concerned about them simply just because we saw a similar situation take place with them last year when they lost their season opener to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And that was quite a surprise as far as I saw it, just because it seemed like to me last year that the Bengals were head and shoulders above what the Steelers were. But, it seems like that week 1 performance from last year kind of carried over into this game when it came to the Bengals. And just the Bengals weren't able to establish any sort of consistency in the run game. They weren't able to establish anything in the passing game as well. And it just seemed like they were just out of sorts the entire day. And, give credit to the Browns. The Browns came to play and they did not hold back. But, you're looking at Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow just got a massive contract extension where he's now the highest paid player in NFL history. And his first performance coming off of that contract signing is 82 yards passing. I mean, that's just a bad look as far as I see it, but I don't believe that this is going to be a consistent trend from the Bengals. The Bengals will be able to bounce back, and they will be one of the more powerful forces in the AFC as far as I see it. It's just, it's early in September, and this is one of those performances where, if you're looking at this from a film perspective, I mean, you might as well burn the tape after you watch it just because it was not a good performance as far as I see it from the Bengals. But overall, I think, both teams can take some positive elements from this. When it comes to the Browns, the Browns, if they're able to establish this run game from here on out with Nick Chubb and then using Deshaun Watson the way that they do or how they utilize him, I think they would be just fine. And I think, if you're looking at this from a positive perspective from the Bengals, there's really not much to take away from here. I would say the positive thing is that I don't think it's going to get much worse than this. You can look at the tape, probably burn it after, and then you get ready for week 2. But outside of that, there was really nothing of positivity that you could look at from the Bengals in this game. This was a pretty tough game as far as I see it with the Bengals, but I do believe they will be able to bounce back and hopefully find some better footing going into next week for week 2. So after that, we are going to transition to the last game. This is going to be the Monday night matchup of the Buffalo Bills going up against the New York Jets. Now, when it comes to week 1, you know, we'll kind of figure out where both these teams are going to go. We don't really have much. I mean, we could look back to some of the preseason games that these teams had, but I'm not really going to focus on that just because, it's a preseason. And, it may give you a little glimmer into what, both these teams can present. But as far as I see it, this is just the general take that I have when it comes to this game. I think this is going to be a really good game that we're going to see take place on Monday night. Simply just because, you got Aaron Rodgers, who's now the quarterback of the New York Jets. He's transitioning from being the franchise quarterback of the Packers for over a decade plus, and he's looking to revitalize his career per se in New York. And I think, when it comes to the Jets specifically, he's the type of guy that can lead this team to be a really effective team, not just in the AFC East, but in the AFC overall. The Jets were really one quarterback away from being what I would say is an AFC contender last year. They had a defense that could really be top tier. They really brought it throughout the entire year last year. It's just that offensively, they were just inept. And, they were dealing with the situation of Zach Wilson just not playing up to snuff. And he's really been kind of a disappointment in his early NFL career so far. But, you go to Aaron Rodgers. I think that Aaron Rodgers is looking at the situation where it's like, I got some decent targets to work with. I got a decent run game with Breece Hall. And he's got a defense that can really play top tier football. I think if you throw those factors together, and as long as you're able to execute on the field, barring some sort of injury, I think this sets up the Jets nicely for this Monday night matchup against the Bills. Now, when it comes to the Bills have been basically top of the pecking order when it comes to the AFC East for the last couple of years. You got Josh Allen, who's one of the most prolific quarterbacks in the NFL, not just only in the passing game, but in the running game as well, just because when it comes to the Bills are not really a team over the last couple of years that have been known to run the ball effectively with their running backs. It's mostly been Josh Allen. Josh Allen will utilize the ground game with extending plays with his feet and picking up good chunks of yards. Josh Allen could go out there and he could pick up 10, 15, even 20-yard runs sometimes just because he could be able to break tackles off of first contact. And I think going into this game, this is one of those games where I think they may try to be a little bit more, how should I say this, balanced, just because when it comes to the Jets, it's like I said, the Jets have a pretty good defense here. And I think, try to beat a defense like that, I think just throwing the ball 50, 60 times, that's not going to get it done. Just because you become too one-dimensional of an offense. And, Jets could be able to bring an effective pass rush against Josh. That's despite the fact that Josh could be able to break out of the pocket and extend plays with his feet and, pick up some good chunk yards here and there. But, to me, when it comes to the Bills are going to have a pretty good chance to be able to score points here. You still have Josh Allen. You got Stephon Diggs, Gabriel Davis. Like, you have targets that you could be able to throw to. I think, to me, it's whether or not that they're going to be able to establish a run game against the Jets in this one. And that, to me, is where things are going to get very interesting. On top of that, the Bills have a very solid defense. The Bills have consistently had a very well-rounded team over the last couple of years. Unfortunately for them, they have never been able to get to a situation where it's taken them to a Super Bowl. They've gotten very close in some of these instances, but they have just fallen short. So, looking at this game in particular, I really think that we're looking at a situation where the Jets and the Bills are going to be going at it back and forth, not only in this game, but the entire year. I think this is going to be 1A, 1B as far as I see it, just because I think the Jets have a very good chance to be able to really go toe-to-toe with the Bills in this game. And I think the Bills have a very good chance to be able to go on the road and get a road win in week 1 to start the year. As far as my prediction is concerned in this one, this one to me is a toss-up. I think this is really a pick-em just because you got really two effective quarterbacks. You've got really good defenses here. This is going to come down to who's going to bring a more effective pass rush and who could force some turnovers. I think if you keep those two factors in mind, that's going to be huge. And on top of that, if you get those turnovers and you flip it into good field position, it's even better because it puts that offense in an advantageous situation where they could be able to score points not only quickly, but they could be able to really turn the momentum of a game pretty significantly if they're able to do that. So as far as my prediction is concerned, I think this is going to be a one possession game when it's all said and done. I'm going to go against the grain here. I'm going to say that the Jets go on they get this home win and they start off the year 1-0 against the Bills. Now, don't get me wrong. I could definitely see the Bills going on the road and getting this win, but I'm going to put a little bit of faith in Aaron Rodgers and the Jets on this one. I think the Jets, they finally have the pieces they could be able to work with to have a successful year this year. And I think they're going to shock the world a little bit. I think, they're going to beat the Bills in a very convincing game, not a very convincing game, in a very competitive game as far as I should say. And I think they'll start off the year 1-0. I think it's going to be a fun game, and I definitely think that people should be tuned in to this one because I think this is going to be one of the better games that we'll see from week one. And it is also the game to close out the week as far as the start of the NFL year. So it's great to be back for football as far as I'm concerned, just because, waited 7+ months to get back into this situation. It's great to be back covering these games. And I take great pleasure in covering these games, and we will do that from here on out for the rest of the year. After that, we will finish up today's episode with UFC 293, and that is mostly going to be focused on Sean Strickland versus Israel Adesanya. So this was a UFC Championship middleweight bout that we saw this past weekend. This fight did take place in Sydney, and Sean Strickland provides probably one of the biggest upsets in recent UFC history with decisively defeating Israel Adesanya, where all three judges scored this 49-46 in favor of Sean Strickland. Now, going into this fight, I'm going to be honest with you guys. I thought that Izzy was going to roll through this fight. I thought Israel Adesanya, after that huge knockout over Alex Pereira to reclaim that middleweight belt, I thought he would have just taken the momentum from that fight, which was not too long ago. That was only a few months ago where he was able to reclaim that belt. And, going into this one, I thought he would have been able to establish some really heavy leg kicks early on, get some effective strikes against Sean, and essentially just continue that pace throughout 5 rounds. Going into this fight, I didn't really see a scenario where Israel was going to knock out Sean Strickland, but I thought just effective kickboxing strikes and some occasional jabs and some overhand rights would have served him well and would have got him in relatively easy win over Sean Strickland. That did not happen. Sean Strickland, I'd say really from the first round on, was putting Izzy on his back heel the entire night. In the first round, really wasn't much. It was kind of a pedestrian first round up until the point where Sean throws a 1-2 punch against Izzy, where Sean is able to land a hellacious right hand against Izzy, where Izzy gets knocked down to the mat. Israel does get back up, but Sean was just wailing left-handed shots against Izzy late in the round. And you can make a point that Izzy got saved by the bell just because Sean didn't land that strike with, I'd say, probably about 30 seconds or less in that first round. Izzy does come back in the second round, but after that, to me, what made the difference in this fight was not only the fact that Sean was able to keep Izzy on his back heel, where, Izzy was basically, his back was to the cage the entire night. To me, it was the jabs that were landing. The jabs that that he was throwing were effective, and it seemed that they were putting a little bit more damage on Izzy compared to what Izzy was throwing towards Sean. When it comes to Izzy was throwing some good leg kicks against Sean. It didn't seem like they were very effective. It didn't seem like they were creating a lot of damage, and it seemed like Sean was taking his shots relatively well. And also, this is another thing that we should focus with on this Sean Strickland Israel Adesanya fight, just from an Izzy perspective. Adesanya looked like he could not really get any sort of contact on Sean. Looking back at this fight, when it came to his punches and as far as his accuracy was concerned, this is one of the lowest accuracies that I've seen from Israel Adesanya throughout his entire career. There was a point, I think, where Israel Adesanya was only landing 15% of his punches or his overall strikes. You compare that to Sean, I think Sean was over double of what he was able to land against Israel Adesanya. That is not a formula for success. That is not a formula for success, as far as I see it, when it comes to Israel here. And it really just kind of carried that self out throughout the entire fight, where Izzy was throwing shots and he really just couldn't land any effective strikes against him. And, give credit to Sean. Sean, I thought, really played this fight well, where it didn't seem like he was, I don't want to say he was engaged. It just, there were times throughout this fight where he was just walking Izzy down, but not really throwing any strikes. And then usually like within like the last maybe 2 minutes or the last 90 seconds of these rounds, that's where he would pick it up and get some effective punches against Izzy. And, going into the championship rounds in rounds 4 and 5, Sean was up 2-1 after the third round, as far as I see it. And, Izzy had a chance to be able to stem the tide and get it back into his favor. But Sean was able to just land these effective strikes, and Israel's shots just didn't do any damage. And in the fifth round, with about 10, 20 seconds left, Sean knew that he had the fight. He was actively walking down Israel Adesanya and basically, talking to him in his face and basically, getting really hyped because he knew that he had it in the bag. And, when it was all said and done, when Bruce Buffer says, and knew when it comes to Sean Strickland being the middleweight champion, it was well deserved. When it came to this fight, I think Izzy was like a 675 favorite going into this one. I mean, this is a big upset as far as I see it when it comes to Sean Strickland getting this middleweight championship win over Israel Adesanya. And you got to give Sean a lot of credit. Sean, to me, is one of those fighters where you don't really know what you're going to get from him. And there are times when I watch Sean, this has nothing to do with him personally. This is just what I see when I'm observing him fight. His facial expression is kind of like mopey. It's not, he's engaged, don't get me wrong. It's just that his facial, like just his facial cues, they don't really, I don't really conclude it as he's like really engaged. It looks like he's more mopey. But I gotta say, I mean, he was focused in this fight. There's no doubt about that. He was landing effective strikes, and Israel really had no answer against him, especially with the fact that Israel was getting walked down the entire night. So I got to give a lot of props and a lot of respect to Sean Strickland for getting this huge middleweight championship win over Israel Adesanya. And now the question becomes, who is Sean going to go up next? Dana said after the fight, in his in the press conference, that they were going to run it back with Israel going up against Sean. And I don't know if that's necessarily the right move here. I think that if we're being objective here, or if we're just being fair, I think that Du Plessis should get that title shot. He's the number one contender in that division right now. And, it'd be one thing if Israel and Sean had a very close bout where it was back and forth and it came down to like a 48-47 score in a split decision win for one or the other. But I think just based on how effective and how dominating Sean won that fight, I think that Du Plessis should get a look at a championship fight in this one. And I don't believe that the UFC and Dana should just instantly conclude that we're just going to run it back with Israel and Sean just based off of what we saw. I think that they should give Du Plessis at least a look at potentially, getting a shot at the title against Sean. That would be a very compelling matchup as far as I see it, just because Du Plessis had a very impressive win over Robert Whitaker just a couple weeks ago. We're not that far removed from Du Plessis just, in my eyes, dominating Robert Whitaker. And Robert Whitaker is one of the best middleweight fighters that we've seen in quite some time. So I hope the UFC reconsiders when it comes to this potential upcoming championship fight with Sean Strickland and Israel Adesanya. I hope they give Du Plessis a look. But overall, I thought it was an impressive win by Sean. The middleweight championship win by him is well-deserved, and we'll see what he can do with it from here on out. But outside of that, you guys, that's pretty much all that we have on the slate for today. I do want to mention, Kevin and I have been out for a while. We haven't been recording really any content over the last 6 weeks, and I want to provide a little bit of context to that. Over the last 6 weeks, I'd been dealing with a pretty lengthy sinus infection where I just could not kick it. There were times where I tried to sit down and do recordings, whether it would be for a segment about the upcoming NFL season or if it was a UFC fight. And a lot of times I would look back at the recordings and I noticed I would clear my throat because it like basically like what I was dealing with was just all in my head. And I just thought that, putting out that content with me clearing my throat basically every 15 to 20 seconds was a distraction. And it would have taken away from the viewing experience. And sitting down for a full episode, I think it would have probably been worse just because you would have constantly heard me clearing my throat, whether that would be when Kev was talking or when I was talking, discussing some sort of analysis on whatever I could have gone over. And also, I do want to mention that, when it comes to Kevin's been dealing with a situation in his apartment where there's been a back and forth situation over some damages in his apartment building where he's been dealing with a leak in his apartment and specifically in the room where he records from. And that situation has not been resolved yet, where, Kev has kind of had to basically reset his whole apartment where he's basically living out of one room in his apartment because apparently his landlord and the company that manages the apartment complexes or that manages the apartment complex have not been efficient in fixing this situation in his apartment building with this leak. So I wouldn't be surprised if Kev's going to be out for a while until that situation is resolved. Hopefully he's able to come back sooner rather than later. Hopefully that situation gets resolved, but we'll just kind of manage it the best that we can from here. So do expect content to be a little bit more regular. We'll put out a couple segments from this. We'll put out some short content, and we should be back later this week with another episode for you guys. You don't have to worry about me clearing my throat anymore. That situation has subsided. It was just kind of a pain in the ass, dealing with a sinus infection for 6 weeks and not being able to kick it. But we finally gotten past it, and hopefully it doesn't be some sort of an issue moving forward. So it's great to be recording once again. I know it's been a long time coming, but it's just great to be back. And like I said, with football being back in the fold, this is the best time of the year for us. We love the NFL compared to the next guy. And as far as I see it, it's going to be a really exciting year as far as I see it with this upcoming NFL year. But with that said, you guys, once again, thank you guys for tuning in. I know on this one was actually on YouTube Live. So if you got a chance to watch it, definitely appreciate you guys tuning in. Like I said, expect more content throughout the week. We will definitely have some of that on the agenda moving forward. And we will be back for our Friday episode that you guys should pay attention to or at least look for. So with that said, you guys, once again, thank you guys for tuning in.